All right, everyone, we have made it to Chapter 8. This is now the last chapter that we're going to cover for this part of the mini semester. Unfortunately, this is something that's a little bit shorter and less involved than some of the chapters that we have covered up until now. The chapter itself is shorter. There's the homework questions, there's not quite as many of them, and I'm rather hoping that these videos are going to be a little bit shorter than what we've gotten used to over the last couple of weeks. So let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 8 is talking about sort of two main things here. There are the aspects of trying to get access to something physically if we're trying to get into a site on which we're doing a penetration test. That's the first half of the chapter. And then the second half of the chapter is talking about social engineering and a couple things about that. The first thing to know, I think, is that if you're trying to break into a place in the process of a penetration test, this is a little bit more rare than trying to access something over the network. And it winds up being a little bit of a different skill set. It's not exactly the same as trying to break into a router, for example. I'd imagine most of you are probably pretty clear on this. Trying to break into a building and into some piece of network equipment are not necessarily considered to be the same skill. That's just kind of a thing to keep in mind before we get started. I think the other thing that's probably worth talking about is that if you're doing any sort of breaking and entering in the course of a penetration test, it's very, very important to make sure that you have a plan for what happens if you were caught and detained by law enforcement. You are going to want to have some sort of letter explaining that the management of whatever company this is allowed you to do this, that you've got permission to do this in the course of a penetration test. And I would think in most sort of situations where you're trying to get access to a building in that way, you're going to also want to make sure that you don't damage things or break things in the context of getting into a building. Very few companies are going to be willing to let you put holes in their server room walls in order to let them know that this is something that's a potential problem that they have. So that's something that's worth talking about. Hang on. We have a cat who has now decided to chew on the laptop cord. So let's just bring you back here. All right. Let's go ahead and start going through these slides. The slides that the book has given us are in a little bit of a strange order. This should look different than what you've got on the website, but I think this makes a little more sense given the order that the textbook goes in. I think. The first thing that we're going to talk about is some of the ways that you can get into a sort of a physical location. And anytime you're doing this, you're going to need to be sort of aware of cameras and fences and these kind of things that are designed to keep intruders out. One of the terms here that the book wants to talk about is something called pretexting, and this is a form of social engineering where you've sort of come up with a fictional reason to get into a building. So if you show up as, say, somebody who's dressed up in the uniform of an HVAC employee, and say, hey, I need to get access to this building because of, and then give them a reason that you just got a call from somebody. If you've done your homework, you can probably come up with an actual name of somebody in the IT department who said we're having problems with the server room, and you've got to let me in, or we're gonna have a bunch of servers that are destroyed or something like that. That's if you use that sort of way to get into something, that's what pretexting is. So let's move on from there. There's a couple things here that we can talk about. I don't think the book actually talks about piggybacking and tailgating, but anytime that you have any sort of controlled access, for example, if you get in with a badge, you might want to just see if you can follow somebody in that has a badge and catch the door before it closes. Now, that's going to depend on cameras or how much employees are paying attention or how you're dressed. There's some situations where people can say, "Hey, you need to let me in. I just left my badge at my desk," or they're able to come up with some reason. That's something that can be used either for piggybacking or tailgating. The book seems to use those terms sort of interchangeably, and one of the ways that you can get past that is what's referred to as a man trap. And I don't know if you guys have ever worked in a building that has a man trap in it, but there's you would go through a door, a locked door, and you would be in a small room, and then there would be another door. So it's some sort of way of keeping people confined to prevent them from just walking straight into a secure area. So and these can be set up in a couple different ways. The ones that we have, the ones that I've seen commonly around Huntsville, have this. The second thing on the list here is called an egress sensor, which is a if you're going through a door that you have to badge in, a lot of times you don't have to badge back out. It'll just let you out because it has a motion detector there that will automatically open the door. If you have one of these in a man trap, it can prevent people from getting in, but it doesn't necessarily confine people from getting out if they were trying to get in illegitimately. So sometimes these can be set up in such a way that you go through a locked door to get into the man trap, and you have to you can go through sort of another verification step at that point to get into the secure facility. But if you realize that you don't have that information, you can't go back out through the door. So you're sort of stuck there until security shows up. Now that's not the way they work in some places. It's not really a man trap in that sort of sense, but there are a lot of places that you're going to see around Huntsville, if you haven't seen these already, are going to have multiple locked doors that you'd have to go through in order to get to a secure area. So that's where that's talking about there. Now, locks and entry control systems here. That's what this slide is about here. Lock picking is something that could be valuable for a penetration tester, and if you have ever used like a credit card to try to jimmy open a lock or um, a hanger to open a car door. That's basically the sort of idea behind something that's a lock bypass. Those can be a physical tool that will let you slide open a lock in some way. There are also lock picking kits. This is a really interesting skill to go futz around with if you guys are stuck at home. You can and are still looking for things to do after the semester is over. Order yourself a lock picking kit and teach yourself how to pick locks. Now be aware that that's if you're walking around with a lock picking kit, that may be something that is not legal in all places. So be careful if you're wandering around with one, or if you want to use something like that in the context of a pen test. That may not be something that is legal in your area. And I think we've already talked about egress sensors. You can be aware that should be aware that those are something that's a potential vulnerability as well. Though, if somebody's trying to get into some sort of secure facility and they're able to trigger that egress sensor either by say putting something through a crack in the door, or if there's glass in the door, they might be able to trigger that. Some of them trigger based on motion, and if you're able to shine lights in it, some of the less secure ones can be triggered by that as well. That's something that's worth thinking about and remembering. Okay, I think so. Badge cloning is something that's also can be a useful skill here. We've talked a little bit about RFID in these classes before. If you have some sort of proximity sensor in your badge or in your car keys or in something that you use to get into really anything that's some sort of secure area, those RFID chips can be cloned fairly easily. But a lot of things or don't even use that. If you have ever tried to get onto the arsenal, they give you a little plastic badge that has your picture and your name on it, and something like that is not terribly difficult to duplicate if you go out and get a badge printer, which is a product that exists. So if you want to print out sort of official looking badges, in the context of doing a penetration test. That's not something that's terribly difficult to do. If somebody's not going to touch it, if they're just looking at it like it's a driver's license, that becomes probably even easier to duplicate, as I would imagine that at least some of you have used fake IDs to sneak into bars when you were younger than probably most of us are now. But if you've ever tried that, that's the same sort of thing that can be used here. So, a couple other things that are probably worth mentioning with physical attacks. Dumpster diving is something that is kind of a common way of trying to get information about something. This is not necessarily going to give you everything that you want in terms of everything that you would be trying to accomplish in a penetration test, but it is a great way to get started. So if somebody if you were able to do dumpster diving on a company and you find a whole bunch of manuals for a particular type of computer or a bunch of boxes from a particular type of network equipment, that's probably the easiest thing to think about finding. That's going to tell you a lot about the products that are going to be used, and if you're trying to imagine what the vulnerabilities are, you can probably figure that out as a result of that information. Very few places are going to just give you a list of passwords and usernames and put that in the trash without shredding it. But there is still some valuable information there. It's a good first step for anything that you would be looking at. So dumpster diving is probably the last thing to talk about when we're talking about physical security. So I'm going to stop this video and then we'll pick it up in a minute when we talk about social engineering.